Hey, hi, welcome to another Acid Left reading group. This is a continuation of the Beyond Linguistics Reading Group, which involves us reading texts and responding through artworks and memes, as well as critical analysis of the themes of those works. So we're basically finishing Adorno and Horkheimer's Dialectic of Enlightenment, a book written in 1944 in the United States by the exiled Adorno and Horkheimer. And it's a book that we've covered over several months on two channels, or you can find the kind of output on a YouTube channel called Theory Wave Nights and on the Acid Left, because we basically started it when we were kind of like mostly making content for Theory Wave Nights and then moved it over to our new channel, the Acid Left. So basically this is our second book, because we started with the Communist Manifesto on Theory Wave Nights, moved on to the Dialectic of Enlightenment, and it's just taken a long time for various reasons. We kind of got interrupted by all kinds of things this year, but we're at the end now, and we're also actually reading at this point Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism as the first part of our kind of series of Mark Fisher's 3 completed works. So we're going to read through Capitalist Realism, Ghosts of My Life, and The Weird and the Eerie in sequence between now and April, and that all appears on the Acid Left channel. So we kind of started that, and now as we started that, we're finishing Adorno and Horkheimer. So this chapter, Elements of Anti-Semitism, is a pretty difficult chapter. We need to kind of basically historically contextualize it before we can really even talk about it, mostly because it deals with, as the title suggests, anti-Semitism and the particular kind of World War II context in which it was written when, as I say, Adorno and Horkheimer were exiled from Germany, from Frankfurt, where they had been working with the Center for Social Research. And they're basically looking at the situation in Europe and generally also incorporating their experience of America and very American phenomenon like the culture industry, Hollywood, etc. And they're kind of looking at how what's happening in Nazi Germany and the United States is kind of the result of an Enlightenment project gone awry. So basically, the Enlightenment promised a kind of a freeing from religion and mythic thinking, false ways of thinking in which humans try and free themselves from nature by tying themselves to a kind of secondary system of rituals and worship that ultimately is unfulfilling, because you end up then being trapped within that and by human-made kind of hierarchies that operate within churches, etc. So the Enlightenment tries to free people from that, but ultimately kind of hit a cul-de-sac very quickly when Enlightenment started kind of picking up on the errors of religious and mythic thinking, that namely is to kind of try and control nature by identifying it. So, in religious thinking, you would try and kind of control the fear of nature, the inevitability of mortality, through inventing saints and gods and things that represent nature and kind of act as a stand-in. But then you find yourself having to pray in front of these kind of symbols, and you kind of, you become kind of a slave to a system of symbols that ends up being no kind of more genteel or offers you no more than when you're a simple slave to nature. So then science comes along and does a similar thing. So we kind of set up measurements, etc., to free ourselves from the domination of nature. So we think if we can measure everything, categorize it, we can somehow become superior to it. But we end up being kind of trapped within the system of measures, principally capitalism and the numerical, the number count, in the form of wages. So we become wage slaves. And this ends up for Adorno and Horkheimer, crucially, in everything being commodified, and the kind of end result of that for them is the treatment of Jews and the death camps in World War II, that people are so far objectified that they're treated as literal objects in the pursuit of wealth and victory in the war. So this is where we get to at the end of the book, via a number of kind of twists and turns, which we'll probably come back to. But the end of the book goes very much into anti-Semitism, how this comes about in its kind of current contemporary form at the time in 1944. So there are a lot of themes that are gone through, but I don't think it's really our job to specifically unpack anti-Semitism as it appeared to Adorno and Horkheimer. That's kind of laid out kind of clearly, very polemically, but it kind of leads on to something else. It is important because of our historical context, and it's actually very important, obviously, also today. But I think we're going to end up kind of going where they take us with that. So the anti-Semitism takes us on to a kind of final kind of passage of the book, which maybe points a way forward out of domination, racism, etc. So that's my introduction, and I think we'll probably end with some reflections on the whole experience of looking at Dialectic of Enlightenment as an entire work. Having said all that, which was probably more than I intended to say, let's start kind of with a meme, as we've made memes and artworks in relation to our reading, and that might kind of like throw us in there and be a simple way of starting the talk. So, Adam, I'm just going to pick one of your two memes.
Okay.
Randomly.
Throw me in it.
Yep. Can't get it on the right screen. So here we are. Here's Adam's meme. So, tell us about this.
Well, yeah, so like you were saying, I wanted to highlight some of the other stuff in here. And this came to me as a strong little line in the book. I think it's on page 160 of my copy. As I was going through and rereading this last week, I was also arguing with a lot of Trump supporters online, which is not a healthy thing, but it's what I was doing, specifically around election fraud in America and these ideas. And it's also highly connected to like the QAnon phenomena. And I was coming to terms with these people, or I was coming to terms with the fact that we are completely in these different realities. So what the quote here is because imagination is involved in truth, it can always appear to this damaged imagination that truth is fantastic and its illusion the truth. So that's exactly what I was, coming up against. And I think that's what we're seeing right now is this paranoid fantasy and imagination out there completely. Like, so throughout the chapter, they keep linking anti-Semitism, and it gets broader and broader, even though anti-Semitism stays the main thesis throughout, to this paranoid thought. And imagination has to be within truth, like in order to conceive of the truth, an element of our imagination is within it. And because our imagination can become damaged by, mass media, by capitalism itself, by all of the systems of domination they've laid out in this book beforehand, that the fantastic will, appear to truth as to the damaged person. And when confronted with the truth of anything, that like the real truth, we'll say, is very easily mistaken as an illusion to that mindset. And so it's a lot about projection and a lot about self-preservation, how self-preservation requires these concepts to be thrown out there and already like kind of established before they can even take hold of the world. Like they can't be thought of without some kind of supplemental concept that's structuring the whole thought process already accepted beforehand. So that's why I chose this quote, because it seemed to really reflect to me this kind of discourse that you see right now, especially around these competing narratives of truth in the world that are becoming ever more fantastic and illusory.
It's a very contemporary quote. Yeah, I mean, there's a part of the book that just seems so much to be speaking about now, even though it's very much grounded in the experience of the 1940s. So I think that was really good. But I mean, it somehow ended up being very universal, even though you feel a bit like, well, can I personally take on the burden and the history of anti-Semitism in the 40s? Not being from then and not being Jewish, but then somehow, you feel that doesn't matter. That the book very much serves its purpose, because you end up feeling that actually this is a very universal experience, which of course is in keeping with Adorno and Horkheimer pointing to the kind of very stupid, for want of a better word, the ignorant aspect of racism that shouldn't really exist, which all fits into this tendency to identify. So you identify nature, that by that I mean you categorize it, you try and ward off its threat by giving it names, and by kind of othering it, as we were saying, in a very kind of identity politics era language. You say, that's not me, it's something else. And by doing that, you feel that you're temporarily at least warding off the principal constant threat from nature, which is that of mortality. So this is happening all the time. But one of those forms of othering is not just othering nature and its threats, but literally othering other people who are kind of part of nature, by saying that they're bad, and this is a consequence of the Enlightenment not going far enough, because the intention of the Enlightenment was not to just replace religion with a numbers scheme and leave it at that. It was to kind of take up this constant kind of questioning and measuring and establishing the truth, so that we would never stop at categorizing nature simply as an other, but we would constantly question our own suppositions, our own presumptions. And that's kind of right at the end of the chapter where Adorno says, well, that's where we still need to push through to.
Yeah, and that it's already determined beforehand. Like that number scheme is already out there. It's like what the world is being understood through, right? Like, or the genus or the type is out there, and that's what's being looked for, and then it's confirmed through that same process, which is a violent process of identification, and it's cynical and sophist. Like it's also like the example they use in this is the way that the Nazis would plead for sovereignty. Like, don't we have national sovereignty? Like, isn't there freedom in the world? So how could we not be allowed to commit mass murder and genocide? And like, that's the kind of thing, which is a ridiculous and cynical use of reason itself, of sovereignty, of freedom itself. Of course, you don't have the freedom to commit mass murder.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's kind of an example of how the Enlightenment gets inverted. So that's the kind of thing that's coming up throughout the book, and it kind of reaches its zenith in this chapter, where I think really it feels at points where there's not going to be a resolution, because I mean, Adorno and Horkheimer are writing so polemically and so much in terms of the philosophical fragment. That is to say, they're deliberately kind of writing in a chopped up way because they feel it might it might be the best way to counter the fragmentation of life under industrial capital itself. This kind of polemical fragmentation coming at you in the first half of the chapter, where they're talking about the horrors of anti-Semitism. It just feels like a lot to unpack. But I think that's, where it's kind of like form is content to some extent. And it's very much the kind of, it's very much what Frankfurt School was doing. Benjamin as well was kind of experimenting with fragments. But as I say, somehow in the chapter, some kind of glimpse of something more positive comes through. But I just wanted to bring in, actually, we have an experiment today. We have a completely unknown to us person. I think Adam has spoken with him before. Your average...
A long time. Yeah, a long time follower and interactor with ours who just doesn't want to be an online personality.
Yeah, by that I mean that it's just, we have someone here who we're going to call your average Zoomer, who is an Instagrammer, and we've been collaborating or talking with him. Adam has, and now he's here and he has some input. So have you got anything to say at this point?
Yeah, I just thought about how this quote, because if you aren't going to go into the deep regarding the anti-Semitism part, we'll have to keep it at a higher level of abstraction, I guess. But that doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing, I guess.
Just to come in, and it's not really that we can't go in deep, but it depends what you had to say.
Yeah, sure.
I just say what you want, but I suppose we have to be aware of the context. And I would just personally question how much I can comment on Adorno and Horkheimer's experiences as Jews. But I mean, by all means, obviously, if you grasp the text and want to reflect on it, that's fine.
Sure. Yeah, I think I get it. But what I started thinking about with this quote was a point from at the very end of this chapter where and I quote, they basically said that the more superfluous physical labor is made by the development of technology, the more enthusiastically it is set up as a model for mental work, which must not be tempted, however, to draw any awkward conclusions. And I think if you think about that for a second, it's a pretty good background to have towards this othering that you're talking about, because ultimately it's kind of a physical manifestation of this very late capitalist idea of everybody fighting everybody. So everybody is a potential enemy, and it's a climate where anybody really could be pointed out as the blamed or the other. Or that was just one reflection I got from it. Do you have any input, maybe?
Well, it did feel very much actually that's the thing. Where, as I said earlier, where one could feel at one point that hang on, this is dealing with a very specific experience of anti-Semitism in the 40s, and one I can't really comment on. At other points, you really feel that it is universal, and they're talking about a mechanism by which people can other people, by which they can become racist. And it does feel very much like today, where everybody is othering everybody else, even in the name of anti-racism. This kind of mistake of what by coincidence is called identity politics, but has nothing to do, is not deliberately linked to Adorno's notion of identity thinking, but actually is something quite similar. Though Adorno says identity thinking, he means over-categorizing things to the extent that everything becomes categorized, even humans, and freedom becomes impossible. Identity politics is a politics based on one's own identity, their own body as a starting point, rather than abstract Marxist economics, for example. So you say, I feel this way because I'm a white man, which is not, I mean, it's kind of actually become that, but the original intention, I suppose, is minorities could say, I feel this way because I am a, non-white, whatever, an oppressed minority. And you take that as your standing point, that empowers you. That's obviously nothing like what Adorno says with identity thinking. But then you get people by now, saying, I am, X, Y, Z, and then the list of kind of like impediments they have to success by dint of their ethnicity, their sexuality, disability, etc., becomes almost a kind of, an inverted mark of success instead. And then they start to then insult other people for not, for being white, privileged, male, etc. And this is where you then get people turning up. I suppose Trump played on this and saying we're going to empower the poor, impoverished white man. But this is all kind of reliant on effectively identity thinking. So identity politics kind of become Adorno's identity thinking in terms of instead of becoming a proclamation of power based on your perceived deficiencies by the kind of elite, it ends up being a means of everybody discriminating against everybody else. So no one's really benefiting anymore. I don't know if I kind of lost you there.
No, yeah. You're Mike. So this part I think clarifies that a little bit to me. Or they say the cry of terror, which announces terror, is mechanically switched on. The screamers deliberately use the wail of the victims, the first called violence by its name, and even the mere word which designates the victim, Frenchman, Negro, Jew, to induce it in themselves the desperation of the persecuted who have to hit it out. They are the false likeness of the terrified mimesis. They reproduce within themselves the instability of the power of which they are afraid. Everything must be used. Everything must belong to them. The mere existence of the other is a provocation. And that's like, you see this, it's almost as if it's it's positing the whole paranoid mindset itself as anti-Semitic. So, it's almost like a conceptual other, which they are calling the Jew in here because they're specifically talking about that. And they're kind of tying all of that othering to that history of European culture through that. And also tying it in with this Freudian interpretation of projection of the other, of the rootlessness of these populations, the projection of rootlessness as a consequence of a wish to be outside of that, to be outside of the homeland, as if it were. So the rooted see anything other than that as a problem. Anything different has to be a provocation to them. From the ruling class at the time, or the I forget the word they use. It's not ruling. Dominant class.
Yeah, I guess that would be pretty much the same thing. I'm not sure why they don't say ruling, but maybe it's just to distinguish themselves from kind of economic Marxism. But like I say, I'm not sure. But here was a very simple meme. I mean, it's kind of crazily simple. It's not because I didn't have much time. It's just because it seemed like it worked. So it's I think you call it non-player character NPC meme, which came about, I think, around 2016, probably first on Chan message boards, often somehow right-wing or used by right-wing meme makers. But it's basically the non-players, the kind of computer-generated characters in video games. So the point is that the guy here has a very blank expression because he's not really there. So the whole kind of meme revolves around the existence of people whose role is very much like the non-player characters in a video game, people who are just there to make up numbers. They're basically just scenery, or they can maybe interact with your character, but they can only follow preset sequences in games like Grand Theft Auto or I don't know what. But, you know, maybe it changes a bit today because often everyone in the game is controlled by somebody because you have these kind of massive online kind of games. But so I
but
mean,
it's those who read the script, basically.
Sorry.
It's basically those who read the script.
Yeah, those who
they're there to facilitate the functioning of the system too, right?
Yeah.
So that's what makes it kind of also a like pernicious meme in some sense when used by the right wing, because it dehumanizes these people to a point of they're there to serve you. They become background, they become nature, as it were, in the way that it can be dominated.
Well, then it has this other kind of meaning that links to that, or at least in relation to this book, I kind of started thinking about this term mimesis and how Adorno and Horkheimer talk about humanity's kind of desire to ward off nature by becoming like it through a mimesis of nature's processes. So magic rituals, mythic religious rituals are ways of mimicking nature. Then you have these saints and gods or magic charms that have some kind of role in mimicking the sun, rain, etc. They're supposed to stand in for these things somehow. So, you know, humans mimic nature somehow. They try and become as sophisticated as nature. And then throughout history, we see kind of, you know, more kind of developed ways of doing this, but they're actually all pretty naive. And they all kind of result in us becoming object-like. And I look at this, again, I kind of alluded to this earlier, but in terms of, say, worship, where you're worshipping an idol and your need to worship the idol at a certain given time every day through certain processes makes you as kind of stone-like, kind of as petrified as the idol. So this is kind of, I think, what Adorno and Horkheimer are pointing at. And, you know, you kind of see this through this othering that you say that, you know, that person is somehow bad, unclean, unintelligent, etc. And you're really projecting on them the things you fear in yourself. So, you know, whilst you're kind of turning them to stone, you're becoming also petrified. And the way you're doing that, because the whole time you're thinking all these bad things about them, all your head is full of is those bad things. So you kind of become that, you know, kind of unworthy or dead other that you're trying to avoid being. And that's the whole kind of point of projection, is that you fear death. So everything that kind of fits into that fear, however kind of perverse it is and however much unrelated it might seem to the basic fear of mortality, you kind of push out onto someone else. But you're not really achieving anything by so doing. So that's kind of what I see Adorno getting at, and he kind of talks about it throughout the book, and then he really kind of unpacks it here. And I may as well then go into my second meme whilst I'm.
Yeah, and so Mike, it's also there that that it is an internal desire. I think is what he was saying at some point too, is that it's an internal desire to them projected onto the outside, because it's harder to fight internal desires for people, and it's easier to fight outside influences. So what they feel and desire, they put onto another to demonize. Yeah,
and I think that's interesting. But then there's a kind of sensation that they never really obviously put it onto the other. It always ends up kind of rebounding. But I just want to go through. So I have this no player character again, but I've kind of put it in stages. something that's happening throughout the book, or certainly early in the book, in the first two chapters. I think it's chapter 1 and Excursus 1, and the last chapter. So you get this kind of no-player character. The first one at the top there is man. Well, Adorno would say man, because back then people would say man. Unfortunately, I've kind of just used Adorno's expression man. Man, woman, people. People see nature or a person, fears its guarantee of death and mimics the objectivity of nature by becoming object. So, I mean, kind of, should we say, by the process I just described, that you fear death, so you put all this kind of fear, or the thing you fear, you kind of put onto other people or other things. But by doing that, you kind of become them. So we just kind of described how that would happen. But you imagine that this mimesis, the mimesis becomes a mimesis of death. So that when you're mimicking, the thing you dislike, the natural object, you become, as dead and still as the object. And Adorno talks about how this kind of like mimesis hardens into a grimace. So you imagine you become kind of still. So there's your mouth, kind of like as the first kind of no-player character figure at the top there. You've become stone. You're not moving. Your mouth is very just kind of like expressionless. But then this hardens. This, with the effort of you trying to resist your objectivity, this hardens into the grimace that Adorno describes in this chapter, that aims to deflect nature. So your grimace is like, he talks about the grimace of Hitler on the podium. He goes through various other kinds of grimace. And it kind of at that point returns to earlier in the book when he's talking about the scream very early on in the first 10 or 20 pages, depending on between 10 and 20 pages, depending on what version you have, somewhere between there, I think, on both versions. And then in the culture industry chapter, the chapter before the one we're talking about, he talks about the smile, which is kind of evoked through Hollywood entertainment. And now he's talking about the grimace, but they're all kind of forms for him of the body kind of responding to nature, but in an inadequate sense, or trying to ward off nature. So now you have this kind of like, this kind of extreme trying to ward off nature becomes the grimace, because you get so tense in doing it. So there's this kind of grimace here on the second character with this kind of really tight clenched teeth. And that grimace, under the pressure of that grimace, becomes the cry, which comes in again early in the book. In German, the Schrecken. But I only say this in German, the Schrecken, because in the book you get the cry and the scream, and you get all kind of different translations. But in the German, you just get again and again the Schrecken, which comes in throughout Adorno's books, and it has a very specific purpose. So, and I've actually, there's a spelling mistake, but it says the cry or Schrecken, it should say the fearful scream, as a subject becomes lost in a natural object, no longer able to distinguish itself from the other. That's what it should say. So you've got this grimace, and it gives way to a scream, as a subject is trying to repel the natural object. But whilst you're screaming, you're not really aware of anything but the scream itself. So it's in this moment of the Schrecken, the scream, which the grimace gives way to, that you actually, rather than resisting the object, you become part of it. Okay, and you think about it, the mouth opening there is where, because the mouth is like the opening both into the kind of interior and out to the exterior natural object. In the scream, you kind of give up and you become both subject and object. Yep. So you've kind of surrendered to the object, and you're indistinguishable from the object. So, that's what happens at one point, and then this gives way. Eventually you're going to stop screaming, and there's what Adorno calls the shudder, which he also talks about in relation to art. Okay. Here he's talking about various kind of facial contortions in relation to, in the beginning of the book, primeval man when faced by the fear of nature. Towards the end of the book, he's talking about very similar processes in relation to industrial capital and our kind of failure to deal with capital, or its failure to deliver us from nature, and our subsequent kind of adoption of things like anti-Semitism as a coping mechanism that don't work. Okay. So the shudder is the release from the scream. So you imagine you finish screaming and you're kind of shaking a bit, but it's a moment of realizing what's just happened. So whilst you're lost in the scream, you can't know your screamer, you can't know you're part of the object, because when you become one with the natural object, you can't anymore rationalize. So when the scream finishes, you kind of reflect, and there's a moment of exhalation and relaxation, and you return to your state as subject, but with a memory of there being a moment of you being unified with the object. So for once, you're temporarily aware of your actual coexistence with the object. So for Adorno, you go back then to the beginning. This is a cycle. So every so often, there's a momentary glimpse via the shudder of the real conditions of us being unified with the object. But it's never going to last. It's always going to be a glimpse that has to kind of keep repeating. And I think Adorno is saying that what the Enlightenment is supposed to do is deliver us from this trap. But to do it, we need to completely yield somehow to the object. But the question becomes, I suppose, is how does one yield to the object without completely losing their subjectivity? And as humans, we're unfortunately resigned to having to keep playing through this process. So anyway, I thought I'd go into that. But I think that's kind of where the beginning of the book unifies with the end of the book. But it's interesting, particularly how Adorno doesn't really unpack this, and I've happened to have been reading it for decades. I don't know if I've got this right. I don't think anyone will ever know what Adorno was really thinking. But the fact that he talks about the scream in the face of unfettered nature in early on in the book, then the culture industry, the smile, and then the grimace, and then the cry or scream again, really for me, it makes me think that he is literally talking about physical processes as acting out this relationship between the subject as the human individual and the object as nature. And it gets into this again in the last chapter when he's talking about the eyes of dictators and how they have this penetrating gaze, and people looking into that gaze and somehow getting lost or becoming disarmed, that the eyes again are kind of a gateway into both the inner subject and the outer object. So it's interesting, I think, how Adorno uses this physicality, which might in a way placate some Marxists that say, the Frankfurt School somehow lose the materialist element. So where does materiality come into this? It very much does tie in with the human relation with the object, and probably could be applied to relations between the worker and objects in the factory, etc. But that's enough from me.
I love this meme or illustration, this process, Mike. It's, having talked to you for over a year now, and having read all of this book with you as well, this is like something that you've brought up many times and so nicely illustrated here. I really appreciate it. Two quick things though is the third one, the crier Shrekken looks like the Pogger's face, and I think that's funny. And also the way this is described too also kind of reminds me of the way the psychedelic community would describe ego death, as done through a large amount of drugs like psilocybin mushrooms or LSD. In that cry is kind of like the ego death, and the shudder is that moment after the ego death has ended, and it actually seems to make sense. But then from there, you cannot actually accurately describe or live in that moment anymore, because in it, there is a loss of the self and the other that is unable to be reproduced when that divide is up. And it also made me think of tying it in with that, made me think of this one line that I highlighted in the book, which was, illusion has become so concentrated that to see through it objectively assumes the character of hallucination. But after that, I wanted to see what your average Zoomer had to say about your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I really like that last quote. I highlighted it myself, and this just makes me think of like the concept of like second nature in like naturalized categories of capital, and how ultimately like the situation you have with like I think this chapter is probably like on anti-Semitism for like historical reasons, but like then again. It keeps reoccurring like within the capitalist mode of production that you ultimately always have groups which are like singled out, as we've like been talking about, as somebody who is fundamentally other, which then again connects back to your meme, Mike. But it's kind of interesting to think about like the historical context in which Nazism happened, really. I know that Postone has a kind of interesting, very short piece on anti-Semitism, which like takes up how basically as the old society was like dying away from Germany, like it was like really a pretty savvy political move to be able to like project all like these interesting but like ultimately like societally very unsettling things for like certain people that happened when modernity really came to be, and like how when you like go into like a new form of society, some things are ultimately going to feel threatening, and there's a real danger in like pointing out groups. Then again, yeah, I think that was about it. Any reflections?
I don't. I mean, I said quite a lot. So, but I would say that that this thing of shudder is important because it comes back in later works. So I may have touched upon this like in much earlier editions when we started speaking about the Dialectic of Enlightenment months ago. But basically, this shudder turns up in Aesthetic Theory, the book Adorno was working on when he died in 1969, and which has been published from his notes, which is basically unfinished. But you can discern what he was getting at from what's been published in the chapter Society. This word shudder comes back in. Actually, comes back in also, I think, in the first chapter, but. He talks about Beethoven's, I think it's his Ninth Symphony, and this feeling of shudder created when you're listening to it, because it's quite a shocking piece. And I think he's speaking about a particular moment of musical dissonance. And he has this whole idea of how music, which is very kind of novel, which surprises you, can kind of break you out of your complacent acceptance of capital and its false kind of categorizations of subject and object as different identities. So this kind of novel music will have the same effect as fearful nature for primeval man. So, you know, this kind of links to art, and really one of the purposes of the acid left is to use art to further the leftist cause, and often actually abstract art. So we kind of get this from the Frankfurt School. Speaking for myself, Adorno, Adam. I can't call Adam Adorno, not yet, but Adam, I think, has similar kind of influences. I'm not sure. Maybe he has also others he would speak about. But that's, I suppose, really why we looked at the Dialectic of Enlightenment, because it really kind of it shows Adorno's earlier thought, and it really lets us talk about the links between a kind of materialist left and a kind of not really spiritual, but a quasi-spiritual left operating via artworks to try and get across a message where subject and object are somehow united, which really in a way is very Marxist, that, subject to, the whole thing of Marx is that that humans become objectified via capital, and surely the aim has to therefore be to somehow live with the object. It can't be to eradicate the object. So there's nothing kind of far out, I don't think, about trying to conceive of some kind of truce, can we say, pact with the object via art. It's something that can very much have a place alongside materialist Marxism. So that's something that I would really like to point to. But other than that,
absolutely. I think that's a good segue if you wanted to show Average Zoomer's video that he made, which is a very abstract piece, while he gives some of his reflections on it.
I think it's ultimately up to you to reflect upon it. But if you feel like it, I could perhaps.
Well, your reflections on the chapter, some of the main points, as we watch this.
That's probably a good idea. Basically, it's interesting, how projection is just so much reoccurring, and basically, I have a rather heavily. My reading is rather heavily influenced by a bunch of sociological thinking in the background, but how you can today see, I know that Mike, I think you mentioned Trump supporters, but how different groups ultimately become pointed towards as a cause of something that is way more abstract, and it's kind of interesting if you try to take this kind of stuff and just apply it to our contemporary condition. It's kind of interesting how since everybody seems so tied down into just we might call it capitalist realism, that even politicians that have modest reductions of the working day in advanced countries are just basically seen as alternatives which could never work, and does anybody else have any input, or it would I'm not much of a monologue person.
I think that's always good if you ask other people what they think. I mean, I'm just looking really, that's why I'm not talking very much. I'm looking at what's going on. I mean, I think it's interesting, yeah. So it's interesting to see abstract art being made whilst thinking about Adorno, and I suppose, also to reflect on the fact that Adorno didn't write much about painting, but it always seems appropriate to talk about Adorno when you think about abstract painting. But it's just because Adorno was very much absorbed in music.
Yeah. But then again, the chapter just reoccurringly gets me thinking about the nature of just capitalist society in general, because as I pointed out previously, just how there is always this space for groups being just pointed out as the cause of something that's really way more abstract, and I just view it as very immanent to the mode of production itself, since capitalism from the beginning has been aimed at producing not for humanity, but for other goals such as war, conquest, and just the expansion of its own logic, essentially. The best account on that we'll get in the book is probably the chapter regarding Juliet. Yeah, I know the term like the neoliberal apartheid society has already been coined, but I think it's like one of the best summarizations of like what we're actually seeing today in society, and I think that like dangerous situations maybe aren't like as far off in terms of like certain groups sometimes, which is obviously unsettling, but it's well worth to think about, because if we actually manage to like think about it at all, that's probably way better than just standing back, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, we're in a really dangerous position. Yeah, I mean, it's anyone's guess where it goes, because there seems to be some kind of like, how could you say it? It's
Power
kind of,
vacuum.
well, yeah, there is that, but I'm thinking of there's kind of a theatrical use of racism by some political elements. I mean, don't get me wrong, the racism is very real, but there's also a kind of acting out of a racism that is actually even more extreme than is being put in play. I think, you know, I think the way Trump courts white supremacists, or at least won't like condemn them, and Boris Johnson has been kind of pretty gung ho with some of his statements, and has made a kind of parliamentary speech talking about woke culture and the need to kind of get beyond or oppose woke culture. But you wonder how much he really means that, or how much they're playing to a public, and then you know you hope that, yeah, okay, there's institutional racism all the time, and that has to be eradicated. But you hope also that, you know, there is no intention to kind of like enact a full apartheid, or you know, some kind of scenario where people are kind of put in camps. But I suppose, you know, it happens kind of in a way because immigrants who arrive in Britain can be put in detention camps, and the same in America, and that could be seen as a start. But anything on the scale of Nazi Germany, you know, also in terms of political prisoners, you kind of hope that it's maybe, it's not a good thing, but it's maybe enough the acting out. You know, they kind of, they go through a process, they talk tough because it appeals to the voters, and that's where we are now. They're talking much tougher than they're actually acting. You see what I mean? They have all these mechanisms by which they probably could imprison anyone who calls himself a socialist, but it's not yet happening. But it's a question of, you know, would that happen? Is that?
Yeah, I think like you're getting onto something like very good, because basically how if I'm going to say anything about this painting of sorts, that's probably that like ultimately what can be viewed as just conventional capital society as we know it, and some more like crude fascist situation is how it like ultimately overlaps, and that like the line between the two aren't necessarily as thick as we might want to tell ourselves that it is. And like mentioning like just how you said like something about apartheid, like these soft mechanisms of like how like groups even within like supposedly free and open like capital society tend to be like heavily segregated, and all of these things like keeps like reoccurring within the system is like something that probably should be like viewed from like a critical perspective of like what we've got, because if we lose that, we end up with like stuff we have now, such as like people viewing racism as some kind of like just transhistorical force that is just naturally existing and isn't like reinforced by anything, just happens to be there. And I think that yeah, I think I finished there.
Yeah, what I find really nice about your painting in context with the book is how it starts off with a ruler. Like that's the first thing you pull out is a ruler. So you kind of have this instrumentality that's going across the whole thing, yet it ends up so chaotic, right? It has moments of strict structure, but it's so chaotic. And it also has this very nature feel to it, like it's nature trying to break through some kind of structure that you see there. Yet the nature doesn't come in till much further after the rationality and the measurement, the instrumentation has taken place. Then you also see your ruler touch some paint and then smear some paint on the page, which almost looks like a wink at one point in a very abstract way. And then I like how you worked around that. I think that's
I can assure you that it was purely accidental. But
yeah, as a maker of abstract art, I could say that is some of the best stuff. When you get those accidents and you're able, when something comes out of them. Of course, just like accidentally spilling a cup of paint across your painting, right there is what I'm talking about. That's a wink. I mean, come on. That is
sure, because it's unwanted and accidental. Like so,
right.
You can think about that.
Yeah, and so then going back to the book or that last chapter, something I found interesting too is they have this idea that they say, I hope I get this right, is basically that Jewish culture is the first to kind of conquer nature in that way and remove itself completely from its animality by taking the old ritual sacrifices and turning them into monotheistic religion. And then through that, you see also the development of enlightenment. And when cultures come behind them, they kind of project that ritual sacrifice that was overcome by the Jews onto the Jews themselves, such as like the practicing blood rituals or forbidden magic, stuff like that. But then they also talk about how, bringing in like a more Marxist sense, the idea of today capitalism having that being founded also on masking that ritual and that ritual sacrifice, and that sacrifice is the surplus labor of the proletariat, right? So, and then how that becomes tied together in the mind of the anti-Semite or the fascist, tying them into like an eternal bringer of capitalism, and that's where you get those hidden hand stereotypes and stuff, which is still popular today amongst alt-right and right-wing conspiracy theories, such as like Soros running things, George Soros, or you even have people bringing up once again like Protocols of the Elders of Zion, things like this. And I think you can also tie this chapter in really nicely within Minima Moralia has the theses against occultism. And it's kind of the opposite side of this, where it starts off with occultism and conspiracy mindsets, and then brings it into anti-Semitism. Whereas in this chapter, it starts off with anti-Semitism and brings it into the paranoid and conspiracy mindset. And they kind of work together to show how these rigid systems of thought kind of form that outsider, and why it's necessary for that type of thinking.
Yeah, it's interesting there how they describe the paranoiac, the paranoid person, projecting an enemy, and how they link that into anti-Semitism and kind of conspiracies of the time around Jewish texts and things, and how that relates to what's happening with QAnon now, and how it really kind of transpires as people feeling powerless, then projecting, someone like Soros as the evil enemy, and thereby projecting a kind of very aware, deliberate tyrant that's controlling things when there maybe isn't one. That, you know, even
Right.
when there's not much sense to anything, people then, in their wanting freedom, project this kind of very rigid, logical kind of process of subjugation that actually perhaps isn't even going on. And then I read something interesting today. It's actually in the Wired magazine. It's a take on QAnon where they say that they examine, or they talk about a study which examined about 350 actual QAnon believers. And it turned out that of that group, under 10% really believed all the things, or you know, the kind of the main principles of a conspiracy involving ritualized abuse of children by powerful Democrats and other neoliberals, and then Trump kind of sizing up to kind of come in and save the world from these terrible people. That actually, you know, a lot of that isn't believed by all of them, and none of them really. Very, very few of them believe all of it. They kind of cherry pick different parts, but it's more again of an identity. You know, it's kind of a thing they subscribe to, that they get enjoyment out of, and I think it kind of is similar to. I think we touched upon this maybe in another talk, maybe the capitalist realism one. To role-playing games, the way people piece together QAnon.
Yep, yeah, we did.
Yeah, but it's very much a desire. It seems people have this desire to have this kind of this dialogue, however terrible it is and however fantastical it is. They're really reaching out for this, which Adorno, I think, describes very well in that chapter. I have to again say Adorno and Horkheimer. We can't lose Horkheimer. But anyway, the painting I like a lot. I really like just the look of it, the way it's filmed. And I think it really works well again with the ruler, as Adam said. You've got some kind of like control going in there with the ruler, and then you have this kind of chaos coming in with the paint that kind of reverts into a kind of massacre with that red paint splurge and everything. So it's this kind of fluctuation between control and chaos, which I think fits in very well with the book.
Yeah,
oh, go ahead.
No, it's fine. You can.
No, please.
Oh, all right. Is he still here? Or yeah.
Sorry, there was something burning on my stove on my.
Oh.
Okay, carry on.
Reality for you. I just thought about like how you mentioned like QAnon, and I think that like it's kind of interesting, like how you mentioned how people usually doesn't like ascribe to, or subscribe to like the whole theory, but they find certain like parts of it worth to like engage with, and like it's kind of interesting because like it seems to like have kind of like the same mechanism as this like anti-Semitic thinking, where you just I'm like drawing on basically Postone now again, I guess, in how like you tend to subsidize, or like you have a subsidy for actually like grasping capital categories, and instead you can just like project it onto some like concrete thing, as some cabal of just like child torturing like evil leaders or something, because it's one way to at least connect to people around you and like feel like a glimmer of empowerment, I guess. But I find it like interesting how it's like kind of the same mechanism of because if you point out to somebody engaged in these conspiracy theories that like, yeah, sure, but give me the evidence of like George Soros, like, I don't know, funding some like evil people all around the world all the time. And they will just imply that like, because they cannot provide me with this evidence, it's essentially truer, like, which is interesting because that doesn't really go with anything else. But yeah, what you said just made me think about that, I guess.
Well, that's very true. Yeah, it's very much a belief system, and that kind of in itself says something about people's need, to have some kind of narrative. And any kind of contradiction is just further support of that narrative for sure. And I think the whole way that Trump has kind of contested Biden's victory. And the way that that hasn't at all kind of like led his hardcore, or rather the very clear victory of Biden has only reinforced for his hardcore supporters the fact that he must have won. And then you get like, well, the BBC in the UK has said that Biden won. Boris Johnson congratulated Biden. He was probably Trump's main ally. I suppose aside from Putin, but none of this serves to create any kind of dent in the idea that Trump in fact is the rightful winner, and this is incredibly frustrating to try and counter. Really, it's very, very smart. If QAnon was deliberately kind of put out there by somebody, this was a very smart move. Maybe it wasn't deliberate. Then it's just very fortunate for the right that it happened. It's catching on in Finland now, where I am. It seems to be spreading, and there's probably going to be no kind of simple kind of end to its spread. And it's just unfortunate for me that the left can't come up with any kind of counter, because it seems like the alt-right and their memes were quite random. Well, actually, they kind of had Steve Bannon pushing them and the Breitbart. But still, it came from the ground, and then I think they pushed it after it emerged through kids playing around. And it seems, unless it was like an inside job by some right wingers in the deep state or whatever, or just some right wingers, who planned that this QAnon would catch on. It's another kind of just case of a meme just getting kind of out of control. But why can't the left have a meme do that?
Yeah, I think it's pretty interesting, but again, if it's anti-Semitism or QAnon or whatever, really, it's heavily centered around essentialism. You have to be able to point towards something and just imply that this is how it is, while the left have a tendency to want to remain rather strict with methodology, etc., etc. So yeah, I think that could be a part of the answer, I guess. But
I think you're right, because I think the closest the left has come to that in the last few years or whatever was in the Occupy movement, the 1% versus the 99%. It's kind of the closest you've had to that easily adaptable, broad ideological meme or narrative, but from a more critical stance, it doesn't quite hold up to all that you would want it to be, because it isn't able to dog whistle and connect with darker movements and powers and stuff. It's kind of that the stuff like QAnon or anti-Semitic tropes can. So its strength is also its weakness in the mimetic sense, which is weird. But we've been talking about projection and paranoia and stuff a lot. Mike, could you bring up the other meme that I made? Because it goes along well with that. I was curious what y'all thought of this one, because I thought it was the better one of the two. I quite liked it.
Yeah, regarding the Occupy movement, I think that the 99% against the 1%, where it succeeds as a small slogan, and it inevitably fails because it doesn't provide any explanatory content at all towards all right, so what's going on in society, etc., etc. It's just it's a more or less empty phrase or empty signifier. So I think that's that. But then you have the alternative of trying to explain from point one, this is capital society, we have labor as the ultimate basis of it, blah blah blah. So yeah, that was just my thought on the 1%.
Yeah, no, I think you're right there. Yeah, when you're not mobilizing people in by tying into those base fears like that, it's a lot harder. I don't think it's impossible by any means, but it's definitely harder to get across if you're trying to actually maintain, a real systemic analysis at the same time. So I like this one. The meme I got up. It's what's it say? It says, because paranoiacs perceive the outside world only insofar that it corresponds to their blind purposes, they can only endlessly repeat their own self, which has been alienated from them as an abstract mania. And then, of course, it's a dog dressed up as Donald Trump with a lot of heavy distortion.
Yes, I like the meme, yeah. And I remember that quote standing out when I was reading it. And I think we've kind of gone over that process.
Yeah. No, we had. I just wanted to show it.
But as a meme, it really works well. Yeah, and I think, anyway, that we've gone over the process, but it's still something we can think about. Yeah, it does seem that, but this is like perhaps why some of these people can be so repetitive. If you see like kind of funny footage of Trump supporters, I mean, I suppose it's like it's maybe a bias that you get so many just really dumb Trump supporters on TV. Maybe it's a bias on the part of like the kind of standard neoliberal media who wants people like Biden in rather than Trump. You just get these insane supporters who just repeat the same stuff, the same stupid points. But it seems, it's valid as a point. There's probably quite a few. There's a hardcore of people that really are behaving like that. That perhaps quite unintelligent paranoiacs that project their own fears onto other people, and then because that doesn't really in itself resolve the source of their fear, because it comes from within them, then they have no choice but to keep kind of like attacking that imagined culprit. And it does operate, it's not just the standardized kind of meme kind of video idiot Trump supporter. It's also happening at all kinds of other levels, but the dialogue perhaps can be more advanced. But if you see Bannon speak, who probably hasn't got like a really low IQ, it's quite erudite, but it's the same themes are coming up again and again.
Yeah, and I'm seeing this online all over the place. Like, I mean, hell, we're seeing it in the U.S. court system now with the Trump appeals or allegations of voter fraud. Some of the witnesses that they're bringing up, I mean, it's amazing. It's there was a viral one. It's a blonde woman in Detroit talking, and as part of her proof that that there's voter fraud, she offers that she signed an affidavit saying there was voter fraud. So therefore, if she was lying, she would be put in jail, and she wouldn't do that. So therefore, there was voter fraud. I mean, and that's exactly what this is describing. Like anything that counteracts or contradicts the narrative is completely dismissed as part of the problem that they're trying to fight against. It's I've been talking to people, and and there's all these. It's like, all right, they would say there's video evidence that if anyone sees it, they could not deny that there was massive voter fraud. And so you say to them, okay, will you show me the video evidence? No, I can't show you the video evidence because you wouldn't believe it. And like, that's a real exchange I had with someone yesterday that is not a bot. It's someone I know. I don't know them well, but they live in my city. I see them occasionally. And that's, and that's the thing. And I'll say, well, they've lost 39 court cases so far. What makes you think they're going to win more? What makes you think this? And they say they haven't lost 39 court cases. That's all a lie that, that you're being spoon-fed. there's real evidence that shows they're winning court cases. Okay, can I see that evidence? No, you cannot, because you only listen to the mainstream media. Okay, can you show me directly the evidence? No, you wouldn't believe it. And it goes on like that endlessly.
Yeah, it's quite frustrating. I mean, what's really incredible is that also it's like, you know, you at some point have the emergent winner that regardless of, you know, the votes, I mean, who ever actually really thinks that, you know, I'm 100% sure the votes were counted correctly? We don't really know what's happening ever, but there is at some point an emergent winner that on balance of probability is going to end up being the winner because everyone's saying they're the winner. So, you know, and I think, of course, probably Biden did get the most votes. But, you know, aside from that, people normally like, okay, yeah, well, that's the winner. You know, it even happened with George Bush when there were only a few hundred votes in it when it came down to Florida in was it 2000? And it's just amazing that people are not even, you know, not even prepared to go along with it in that sense. I mean, what like blue collar Republican is going to ever know how many votes there were for each side unless they were counting them themselves. But it's just amazing that they, you know, regardless of that, Biden's going to be inaugurated, and when are they going to give up? It's quite interesting the amount of kind of staying power this kind of mythos around Trump has. And it's like it's kind of like it's the right person in the right place at the right time for a certain portion of Americans.
But like,
yeah, go on.
I think it's interesting, like how if we don't think about these people as like, sure, we could like point out that it's like fundamentally irrational, etc., etc. But if we try to view it like from their perspective, in that they probably feel rather well. They might not have like the securest position in terms of employment, etc., etc. And when like Trump has postulated this like mystic, like "Make America Great Again" policy, and they've been like fed like the same neoliberal agenda for decades, like it's like no wonder that like people actually come up with stuff like as the stuff you're referring to, Adam, because people are like essentially desperate, and if somebody like ultimately mobilizes this like postulating of like a mythic past that is like ultimately like a fascist tactic essentially, it's not very strange that people go to like extreme lengths to like just uphold the lie that they are actually in the belief that they're going to benefit from.
You're not going to say anything. I mean,
oh, sorry, I didn't realize I was muted. Basically, yeah, I'm with you there.
Well, but this thing of like, so you know, yeah, but the left don't have like the ability, or it's kind of contrary to the left, to basically spin a deliberately untrue story that's also racist. You know, so we can't do that. We can't keep up with the right for that reason. But, you know, if a lot of it is just repeating, and by repeating it kind of sticks in people's heads, then why can't we just repeat something, you know, that can compete with the kind of right-wing narrative, as in, you know, the ruling elite, or rather, you know, wealthy people employ you for their own profit, and they, you know, you would somehow just be much wealthier if your workplace was owned collectively rather than by, you know, one wealthy person. And why don't we make that happen, and we can all share? And it wouldn't mean you lose something; it means you get something more. Why isn't that a good narrative? It's like, I think I come back to this in different episodes, podcasts, and different reading groups and things. But it just I don't get it. It's like, why can't we spin that narrative so people dig that narrative instead of the, oh, your money has been stolen by immigrants?
Yeah, I think.
I don't think anyone's playing. I mean, I'll just like finish, but you know, I just I think part of it, of course, is we're not allowed to spin that narrative. It would get stamped out so quickly by the establishment. So I guess that answers itself. But what answer did you have?
I just think I was like trying to get this point kind of across earlier, but like people, when like they've been socialized into like capitalist society, ultimately seem so utterly cynical towards like any attempt to do anything that isn't like basically giving you a bigger cake or like a bigger piece of the pie, while taking stuff away from somebody else. That like you can't even like get some like a radical social democracy that says that like, oh, we're in a like very high tech society, so we could totally like cut the working hours to 6 hours. Like if you aren't even able to get that kind of stuff across, because people are just so totally cynical about like what can be achieved, then the best bet is probably to postulate something that's like way beyond like the imagination of like common people. Because if you like manage to secure like one or two positions in something that's like fundamentally like beyond this mode of production entirely, then I think that probably has the same weight as just postulating a mythic past. But then like if you postulate like a future, like even beyond like, all right, we can have like a factory that we own, that we toil in all day, because ultimately like that might not seem very like appealing to certain people. But like I think values as free time, for example, is something that the left should totally take up.
Yeah, absolutely. We should take that up. And I guess this is what we're really shifting out of, or maybe not completely. This shows the link probably, but we're shifting from Frankfurt School to like Fisher's later writings. You know, that's a lot of the stuff that he's talking about, is centering not alleviation from suffering, but the promotion and production of collective joy. And that's like kind of what his writings right before the Acid Communist introduction came out. And like that's what you kind of see there, drawing from maybe some of the other Frankfurt thinkers, such as like Marcuse. And I think that's the way, because it also ties into those same libidinal energies that right-wing populism, fascism, anti-Semitism, homophobia, you know, like all of these fearful ideologies are tying into, but it's trying to direct them in a way that is a collective project that does try to realize the promise of enlightenment, without excluding, without needing an other.
Yeah, I suppose the Frankfurt School are also pointing to the possibility of an enjoyed life that isn't constructed purely in terms of how much you earn, or the possibility of shared wealth, but there being another element to subjectivity that involves culture. Well, I think Adorno, you know, he's accused of being an elitist, and I suppose that's the problem there. He doesn't really get into like how could we all enjoy culture and its you know its capacity to expose the false conditions or false separation between subject and object. That's something that for him that happens to just very few people listening to concert hall music or reading literature. So unfortunately, I suppose you need to append that to some kind of mass movement like the hippie movement, or the possibility of a mass movement existing that could give everybody that ability to appreciate culture in that way, and then we collectively emerge from this kind of false system of identification. I suppose that is what Fisher's, well, maybe is what Fisher's acid communism was pointing to, but I mean that's kind of like certainly how we've been appropriating it
Yeah, that's the way I read it. That's the way I want to read it, at least, as my paranoid self
I suppose that
takes.
Yeah, well, I suppose that would be a place to kind of wrap up, because it kind of brings us to why we, as the acid left, looked at Adorno, and then we get in this last chapter, Adorno and Horkheimer, examining the mechanisms of power via racism, particularly anti-Semitism, and that seems to have like massive parallels with today and the QAnon movement, and prior to that, the alt-right movement. And the answer, I suppose, for Adorno is that we stop trying to categorize, that we take up the potential of enlightenment that keeps questioning, rather than questioning so far as to reach a set of categories that we can kind of fence in nature with, and then to stop there, that we're supposed to keep kind of like taking up the question again, and that preventing us from scapegoating people, because that is, I suppose, just a very simple kind of question. What is the problem? How do we solve it? The problem is over there, and you point to another group of people, and Adorno says that shouldn't be the answer, really. That you then have to like take that as the new question, or never find yourself in that kind of point of a cul-de-sac where you've got the answer and it's them, because that's only ever going to rebound on you, because it's insufficient, because it's not as simple as there being a kind of objective other kind of entity responsible for your suffering, that it's always going to kind of rebound on you because of our entwinement with nature. And I suppose that's what Adorno says with enlightenment, that we need to push through this and accept our fundamental link to the object, which is never going to give us like an outright simple solution to everything. It's something we're going to have to learn to cope with. And kind of we're saying that one way of coping with that is through art, that through art you can kind of constantly renegotiate your relationship with the object by making stuff in clay or oil paints, or by making memes. It's much the same process. You are interacting with objects, with color, with your computer keyboard, with with whatever. It's all a kind of making a pact with the object. So I think that we've kind of found Adorno and Horkheimer very useful in reasserting that point, but we couldn't say, okay, that's the answer, because that would be completely against the whole kind of thing we've discovered. You have to take that and then do something with it. And I think actually that's something very useful, that in terms of like talking to Zoomers, millennials, people making memes like we make memes as well. They're making YouTube videos. It's trying to like give it that purpose, that there is something actually in the playing with the object that has a Marxist value, or leftist value, should we say. So that's why I think this has been useful. Anyone else want to finish with something?
I'll just say that I am also glad that we took our time with this book. We didn't actually intend for it to take us long to go through, but you said we had some pauses in in multiple places there. But to me, it's such a dense book that having those pauses in there really allowed me, because I reread most of the chapters multiple times, and allowed me to do that and to think upon them and to read some supplemental stuff while going through it, because you need that with this book. It is not one that you can sit down and just go through and kind of understand, I think, or at least I couldn't. The longer I sat with the ideas, the more they resonated and played with each other throughout the book. The interwovenness of it is really something else when you take it in its totality. I'd also, if if people have listened to this and they find this interesting and they haven't read the book, I do recommend that. I'd also recommend reading Minima Moralia's, like I said earlier, it's the whole book is great. It's these short little aphorisms, but specifically the Theses Against Occultism ties a lot of this in here, especially with all of the talk that we've had today about like the paranoid mind and the conspiracy mind. It's like 2 or 3 pages, and it's a really easy one to read. So if you're not going to read the whole Dialectic of Enlightenment, that's a little piece I would recommend for specifically that kind of thought that, again, like that we elaborated on today. But no, that's it.
Hey, so that's that. Thank you for joining us. This has been the final session of the Acid Left Beyond Linguistics Reading Group, where we've been reading Adorno and Horkheimer's Dialectic of Enlightenment, and we're now continuing with Mark Fisher's 3 finished works, Capitalist Realism, Ghost of My Life, and The Weird and the Eerie. So we've been joined today by our average Zoomer, which is the pseudonym of somebody who wants to remain anonymous. If you want to join us, we'll be having a public reading group for Capitalist Realism when we finish reading it in our smaller group on January the 6th. That will be 2021. And we'll be publishing the Zoom link in the coming weeks. So stay with us for the next installment of Capitalist Realism, which will be published in a few days from now, I guess. And remember to subscribe to our Patreon, patreon.com/Acid Left, and otherwise to follow this YouTube, to follow us on Facebook and Instagram, which is, I believe, at the Acid Left. All your support is greatly appreciated. We hope you'll join us for future episodes and continue to work with us in our quest to make art useful to the left and make the left useful to the world in forging ahead with a world that is just for all. Okay, thank you. Until next time.